Are you satisfied with your understanding of sustainability? If you are not, imagine a journey together, a pluralistic one, with academia, innovators, startups, NGOs, all looking for solutions to the greatest challenge of our time. My name is Samuele Tini, and this is the Sustainability Journey. Welcome to a new episode, and today we are going back to academic world, and we do it with a change maker, somebody who has been studying social businesses, the better business, the movement for the business for good for so many years. And we will discuss also his latest book, which has been released just a few days ago. So I am pleased to have here Professor Christopher Marquis from the Cambridge Judge Business School. Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us today.
Samuel, I'm just really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
And Chris, we want to know about your, all bestseller books, Better Business and all the MAO markets, and now your new book. But before that, for our audience, who is Chris? What is your sustainability journey?
Good question. I guess with the title, The Sustainability Journey of the podcast, that's a good first question. I think that, so I've been studying these topics for 20 plus years now. And I think that my inspiration has really come from students. This is something, I got a PhD from the University of Michigan. And then my first job was actually at Harvard Business School. And I had the real great opportunity to teach some classes on, then it was called corporate social responsibility, but, very much focused on environmental issues, social justice issues. And I think the passion of the students for the topics is what really got me passionate about this. And particularly my work on B corporations, actually, I had never heard of that before, and students introduced me to it. So I think that the younger generations are much more in touch with innovations in the area of sustainability. They're much more passionate about it. And so that has really rubbed off on me.
Fantastic. And I still remember when I started my dissertation for my MBA, the case study that you wrote, Harvard, the discussion about B Corp, and then your book, that was part and staple of my journey toward discussing B Corp.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And in your career, you have also worked with the big names of business. So from JP Morgan, then you went to Harvard, and then now you are at Cambridge in Europe. So how also these corporate experiences at work there has shaped also the views on the business that you have today?
Yeah, I think it's really had a very fundamental, orientation. Fundamentally shaped my orientation, that I'm actually interested in how the ideas, theories, studies of academia can actually help in the world more practically. Certainly some of this that I examine looks at, social entrepreneurs, social innovators trying to make the world better, but also I think policymakers, investors, other sectors are also really important constituents that our academic work can help influence how they can be better change makers themselves, and also how we can have cross-sector work for social and environmental good.
And talking about social businesses, your first book was Better Business, and it has a transformation and a discussion about the B Corp movement. The B Corp movement that we have touched a lot in the podcast, but let's say it is the first book that is also I cited a lot in my work and my dissertation. So how can you explain a bit for our audience, how do you think this movement is really remaking capitalism, as you say in your title? And also, which are the challenges to move from, when you start the book, from the shareholder-centric view to this stakeholder-oriented model?
Good question. And I think it's really, this idea of transitioning away from shareholder primacy, I think is a huge challenge for the world, because I think a lot of the, issues that we have around climate change and inequality really can be traced to this, short-term orientation of companies that pushes cost onto society, which, really is the theme of my new book, which I know we'll get to, but let me sort of backtrack a bit and talk about the importance of the B Corp movement, to this issue. And I use the term movement in the title of my book very, very consciously, because I see what, B Lab and globally now there's 30 some, B Corp, B Lab affiliates around the world, people working in academia like you and I, people working with policy makers. There's been a lot of legal changes around these issues. It's all about working together to try to create a new system. And where I think the movement is so important and influential is not about increasing the number of B Corps. Certainly, I'm a fan of. I mean, I a lot of the clothes I wear now, are from B Corps. I seek out B Corps in my life to wear and use and eat and support without a doubt. But I think the most important thing is that a bunch of tools and processes that all businesses can use have been created. Now, this is the B Impact Assessment, which is a tool that companies can benchmark, can measure, can be transparent around a variety of their different stakeholder impacts, from workers and environment and communities, et cetera. And this is important because actually many companies don't know how to actually manage these type of long-term risks. And hundreds of thousands of companies actually are using this tool. And so I think it's very, very valuable. Many tell me it's really transformational for their company. Also around corporate governance. So there's actually a new type of company sprung out of this movement called the Benefit Corporation. And I think this is also equally as important, because if you are not able to align your governance with the purpose of the company, this is like a misstep from the beginning. So, I teach, I've always mostly taught at business schools, and I teach in the management area, and alignment within the organization is like management 101. And so if your legal principles are in conflict with your purpose, your company's never going to succeed. So I think that these tools are really essential.
And thank you, Chris. And it's really important. I read a couple of books in the past, and one that really touched was this Net Positive. You may know. I mean, Paul Polman was also one of the. And one sentence it really struck me. So this says, paraphrasing, that every business should consider becoming a B Corp, at least in spirit. So you've wrote the book in 2020, and of course now, how do you see now? Do you agree with that sentence now after of Polman? And which are your views in the future of the B Corp movement, especially you have seen now from the time you wrote the book and now and maybe the future?
Yeah, in spirit, I do agree with Paul's statement. I think it makes a lot of sense that sort of all companies should be striving to be accountable and actually have greater social and environmental impact, without a doubt. But in many ways, I think that this should be the standard way to do business. So, it shouldn't be an individual decision of a company. This should be the playing field that all companies actually need to be considering their social and environmental impacts and be responsible to society. So in that way, I disagree a little bit with the way that Paul puts that, is that companies should consider. I think that the ethos and processes of becoming a B Corp should be the baseline. And I think that this actually, we're moving in that direction. It's slow, but the EU has implemented a number of different legal changes recently, from the green claims law, where companies, can't just blatantly greenwash, they could be sued as a result of that, to a new, sustainability reporting framework, which is hugely important and includes scope 3. Companies can be legally liable for what they're reporting. It applies very broadly. So I think that actually, B Corp should be the minimum for all companies.
So like an hygiene factor for businesses. If you are not also making to that threshold, you cannot be considered even a business. And we are really moving toward that, and we hope that more and more, and especially here, especially now also in Africa, where we are standing. With Bilab, we are trying to push that revolution of sustainability. And before going to your book, because I can see you also went to which are also the emerging market. That's why I put also Africa, because I really like. And Asia has been, I mean, it's no longer emerging, but I think it's an emerged power. And your second book, a really interesting one, is Mao and the Market. So China and a unique economic system. Every day we read about China from one side to the other, and sometimes partisan positions and trench position discussion. So can you tell us, from an academic point of view and your study and your deep understanding of Chinese economic system, which are the key differences you have identified between Western and Chinese businesses practices? And also, they have implication for global business leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I originally got into studying Chinese business and the economic system in China because of my interest in sustainability. This was, I was spent for a variety of random reasons initially, but then really was taken by the environment, the vibrancy. So I spent between 2010 and 2020, 3 to 4 years actually on the ground in China at Chinese universities, talking to a lot of Chinese companies, very much about sustainability and air pollution, other kinds of pollution, huge issue there. But also the government being, basically a dictatorship, can actually solve that much more easily than a place like the US, where I'm from, where it's very challenging to get any sort of decisions made given given the branches of government and the politics right now. So I thought it would be an interesting sort of counterpoint to my studies in the West to study a more top-down authoritarian country that is also more emerging, so it has a lot more pollution. So that has been, the variance between more bottoms up versus top down has been one of the key differences. The book that I wrote, Mao Markets, really hones in on the ideological system in China and how that differs. The thing about China is that, we see Western states, and there's things like the rule of law, there's things where, the government is in some ways the final arbiter. But in China, the Chinese Communist Party actually sits above the government. The military in China, for instance, does not report to the government or the state like like virtually any other country. It actually reports to the Chinese Communist Party. And in spite of this, there has been this incredible economic success story in the last 40 years in China. When I was growing up in the US and there was a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, my idea of a communist dictatorship would be, very bureaucratic, very slow moving, not very economically agile. But China is the opposite, actually incredibly vibrant. And so in the book, we try to sort of unpack, the unique features of the Chinese economic system so that both a sort of ideologically driven dictatorship can actually coexist with a vibrant market economy.
And thank you, Chris. I really like, because we grow up with the idea of the Soviet Russian bureaucracy, even Kafkian. And then on the other side, you see China, that is one of the most vibrant area in the world. And really, this question goes a bit deeper. Just based on this, how the Chinese company are really addressing sustainability and innovation. And there are some lessons from your work that we as Western and companies can apply and can learn from their Chinese counterparts.
Yeah, I think there's a much more of a long-term orientation, which I think is very useful. I think also, whereas there are potential risks to many businesses with the Chinese Communist Party playing such a strong role and not having the accountability mechanisms maybe as governments have around the world. Also, if they want to do something and want to focus on an issue, it's much easier and there's a lot more support. And I think that that's something where on the environment realm, particularly around, new product areas like, electric vehicles or solar panels, wind, the government has put in a tremendous amount of attention. And as a result, you see those sectors really thriving. And in all three of those sectors, actually, China is very much leading the world. And so I think that a lesson that I see is, the importance of, the state being very proactive in trying to create incentives for companies to innovate in these new areas, like, electric vehicles. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, China, currently is leading the world in electric vehicles. And 5-10 years from now, I think the gap is even going to be bigger as their cars continue to be, exported to different countries around the world. So that's some of the insight.
No, and it's really one really point that you have mentioned is the long term. And this is also what you have said before, this short term shareholder-centric discussion. I was reading the other day, finished reading a book about purpose, and where there was the insightful story about Boeing and how they lost purpose to short-termism. So, and this really leads to your book, the upcoming book, so the Profiteers. So you really discuss in the book the hidden cost of corporate action on society, the environment. So can you talk about the societal environmental cost of what you call, I mean, really strongly, the corporation free lunch?
Yes, it's business free lunch, which is also summarized in the subtitle of the book. Companies privatize profit and socialize costs. So the idea being in that this it's a abstract economics term called externalities, which basically are the costs that business does not have to pay for its production, but that society or the natural environment pay. So the most famous example, or the most well-known example now, is carbon emissions. So, we have companies typically don't have to pay anything for their air pollution. Carbon into the atmosphere has created climate change, creates health impacts for people more locally, environmental damage, et cetera. So this is the free lunch. I mean, if business actually had to pay the cost of its production, many companies probably would go out of business because they wouldn't be able to actually handle those costs. I saw, one estimate around carbon emissions where I think it was like for every $10 in one location in the US, every $10 of that it would cost for a utility to use a coal-fired process to produce electricity actually created $8 of health damage to the local community, and then $8 of additional, environmental effects, like, global warming, et cetera. So really, the company is paying $10, but it should be paying $26. And so many industries actually would be losing money if they actually had to pay for these externalities. So I try to identify the environmental, be it, air pollution, be it waste, be it harm to our natural world through agriculture and to biodiversity, to as well as a number of societal, social type of issues around, abuse of human rights, inequality, discrimination, which really are things that business is able to capitalize on, but actually, they should be sort of paying for that. So that's sort of a key theme of the book as far as my critique, which is captured in the title.
And fantastic. It's really something. And I'm so glad that you are also one of the leading business schools in the world, because also to change the mindset of students on that, which when in our days, when we studied the MBA, of course, those courses like this is externality in economic theory and finished, but it needs to be a cost. And how this economic system that you criticize in the book really shape the future of our society and our planet. And how us as consumer, or maybe the regulator you mentioned a bit, can act, and what we can do in taming this free lunch or free rider behavior.
I think the policy plays a big role. I think that consumers can play a big role, but I think that a problem and why I focus on this as not just a neutral concept, but business has done a tremendous, in my opinion, unethical disservice to humanity by convincing us that we should be responsible for these factors, not them. That governments should take responsibility, not them. So, for instance, think about all these terms like carbon footprint that individuals supposedly have. That was actually popularized by BP. They want people to think that oh, you should take it, you shouldn't fly, you should worry about your carbon footprint, when actually 70% of carbon emissions in the last 50 years have been from 100 companies, BP being one of the top of the list. So really, they shouldn't be worried about individuals' carbon footprint. They should actually think about themselves. The list goes on, things like, recycling is actually another, plastic recycling. Less than 10% of plastic is actually recycled. But companies, instead of actually changing their packaging, or doing advertising, oh, you should recycle, when they know it's not going to get recycled. It's this horrible, actually very unethical. I have a chapter in the book called corporate gaslighting that highlights these various greenwashing and PR and other, sort of perspectives. So consumers can play a role, but I just want to make sure that we know that actually, companies are the ones who should really be very held accountable. And in the book, I do, talk about a variety of innovative companies that have actually said, okay, we see that this is a big issue around companies pushing their costs on society. So we're going to find creative ways to actually address that. So one company that I studied called Grove Collaborative, it's a company in California that sort of makes and sells a variety of health and beauty type products. And the CEO, Stu Landsberg, said to me once, he said, our biggest externality is plastic. And we're doing everything we can to eliminate that, sort of reformulation of products, redeveloping their business models so that they don't have to actually use plastic. So I think that one important lever is corporate innovation, but clearly that's only going to be, the pioneers and the innovative companies. We then need to take those innovations and have governments, really be much more stringent in how they actually are, and regulating, disciplining companies. We talked a bit about the EU already, around these, plastic. I'll just continue that example. I mean, plastic is just one of many examples, but it's a salient one that we all can sort of see and know about. There's a lot of discussion around, EPR, extended producer responsibility. And these are great, important, important, policies. However, frequently companies, packaging companies, beverage companies end up lobbying very hard to water them down, or have them, sort of really focus on a lot of recycling when in recycling, of course, we should recycle if we have these materials. But really, the focus should be around creating new products, new packaging alternatives to avoid and to eliminate. That is the solution. The solution is that, not new recycling. And so I think whenever you hear a business tell you about recycling, that's bullshit. Excuse me. Hopefully you won't censor that out. But yeah, anyways, that's.
No, it makes totally sense. I mean, I can share that we discussed with the B Corp back in Nairobi just 2 days ago, and what they told is exactly they are trying to support waste pickers and others. Then say, even if we stop today, we will be in business for the next 50 years, and just in a country with Kenya, which is a medium country in the world, so I cannot imagine. I mean, and really. One critics that would come to you that would imagine is like, oh, okay, yes, you are touchy-feely, the usual California and others. So, but is it possible to really more responsible practices without compromising profitability? This is also the debate that sometimes the backlash against ESG and other things. And then you have mentioned one, but can you mention even some other companies that are really leading the way in that?
I think sustainability requires some hard choices. I think that the government is really important to be involved. I think that another part of this corporate gaslighting I've been talking about is around, this idea of doing well by doing good, that sort of really undergirds stakeholder capitalism. Certainly, there are examples of companies that do well by do good. No doubt about that. Or, examples of this around, energy efficiency or decreased waste in packaging. But frequently there might be a tension between, particularly in the short to medium term, that companies need to be very upfront and think about what their sort of responsibility is, to their consumers, to the future. I think that, the more companies advocate this doing well by doing good, they want to actually avoid regulation so that, the regulators will think like, oh, companies will voluntarily do it because it's in their self-interest. And I think that, I think we have to be realistic. And I think that the government, really, is playing a very important, must play a very important role in that. That's why I'm very encouraged by much of the work of the EU and how it actually is going to be applying to companies, more globally. Yeah, so that's on the sort of the profitability point. You had something else about companies.
So some company examples, because really I have noticed, and especially on social medias now, there is a huge, maybe political, because in the US is election year, so there is a huge backlash against sustainability, against ESG and craziness. That's really touched me, and sometimes I think it's kind of crazy because we won't have a planet if we continue like this in the next 15 or 20 years. So what's the point to this? But this is this for.
So I think this is something where the U.S. has really, unfortunately, gone off the rails. I think that, if you look at much of that anti-ESG discourse, it's actually, and if you peel back the layers of like where the laws come from, where the talking points for politicians come from, it's actually funded by a lot of these, sort of fossil fuel groups, Koch brothers, Heritage Foundation. There was an analysis done of all the anti-ESG legislation that was put forward, and like the language was cut and pasted from, reports from those organizations. So it's about the self-interest of these people that are unethically destroying the planet and the future of society. And so, it's not, I think we need, and I'm in my book, try to be very forthright in calling this out. And I think we need to continue communicating this so people can realize that actually, we are at a critical point in humanity. And so I think, as far as, with these climate issues that are just escalating, that, we need to focus our attention. I think that, the EU is on top of this, Latin America, around the world. I think people, the fossil fuel lobby is not as strong, and companies and individuals and regulators are actually, able to look at things a little bit more of a clear-headed way.
And let's go to the positive, because from your viewpoint, and how do you envision also this? Because of course you have criticized, and there is a strong point that you are making in the book about this behavior that is pushing externalities towards that. We can really, in the teams, we can really see from the extractive, I would call it, model of capitalism to a more really regenerative model of capitalism. And if so, which are the solutions that you propose in the book?
Yeah, I think that this idea of regeneration is really, really important. It gets talked a lot about, maybe sort of some people see it as a buzzword. Maybe some people or some companies are actually using it as either explicit or what I sort of think of as like implicit greenwashing. Explicit greenwashing is when you sort of don't do it at all, but more implicit isn't the right word, but it's like distracting, selective distraction. Greenwashing is a company like Pepsi, for instance. They talk about regenerative agriculture. They talk about, and they probably are actually doing it. I'm not, like the actual program, I'm not saying is necessarily greenwashing. But if you look at a company like Pepsi, they make sugary beverages with ingredients that are linked to cancer and obesity. They have a division, Frito-Lay, that actually the products are formulated to be addictive. They transport their products in all this plastic waste, and they're actually actively engaged in basically convincing consumers that they should recycle instead of actually changing the way that they're actually, sort of transporting their products. So this is a company where, they're talking about regeneration, but if you look at the core of their business, it's anything but regeneration. So I think that as we think about actually regeneration, I write about regeneration in the last part of the book, because really the concept there is about positive externalities. It's about actually returning more to the community or to the natural environment than actually is taken. And I think a lot of companies are starting to see that and look at their business models and see how can we actually account for our business model in a way that we return positive dimensions. So one company that I really think is sort of pioneering in this is Natura, the Brazilian-based cosmetics company. And they actually have innovated in having a integrated profit and loss statement where they're actually able to calculate the positive and negative externalities that flow from their business in the natural world, socially, but also in their human capital. Some areas, they are negatives. They admit and they document the negative externalities, but actually also by doing that, they can see how they can actually end up resolving it and becoming a more and more regenerative business. So there's pioneering companies that I think, are showing the way that a more regenerative system is possible.
It's really important. It touches also on how the pioneers can be the leading the way and expand the movement and really help companies to go to a deeper level of acknowledgement. And I can see what you said before about companies and other. Of course, if your core business is about making people fat, on the other side, then there's a lot about purpose. We remember all the launching and other discussion, but of course, at the core, it's really still a business which cannot be a purposeful business. But then apart from and then it's really interesting, and the discussion for me it's something that interesting and wonderful. We will put the links of the books and everything because I'm sure people will discuss. And for our listenership, which is listened from all over the world, so not only the usual US, UK, but even we have strong listeners in Africa, people in Asia, and others. So, Christopher, as a leader, as a change maker, somebody has been at the forefront of the study of sustainability for so many years. So, which advice you can give, even for people that maybe they are business leader, even business leader in emerging markets? So, how we can really integrate sustainability, responsible practice in companies, or even in our behaviors?
Yeah, to me, at the company level, it's a question about analyzing, measuring, et cetera. And I think this is something that the B impact assessment is really magical in some ways in doing, because it allows companies to actually see how they're doing across many of these aspects, and then also benchmark against what other companies are doing. And it applies globally. I mean, there's B Corps, from I forget the number of countries, but it's close to 100. It's and one of the things that I heard recently that is really really inspiring to me around the B impact assessment is in Malaysia. Actually, the government has been funding many small, medium-sized enterprises to actually use the B impact assessment in order to actually help improve the ESG of the companies. If you think about a country like Malaysia, has a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises that are in the supply chains of companies in Europe, companies in the US. And with these new European regulations around measuring and reporting on impacts, the Malaysian government realizes we can have a real competitive advantage if we're able to actually, be more effective in our ESG. So I think, this B impact assessment is a really powerful tool. It's free. I think that all companies should, if they don't use it, they should at least take a look at it.
Fantastic. And as consumers, apart reading your book and discussing, what we can do as a consumer, as somebody that is there?
I think, obviously, your purchases matter. And so I think that's something that's important, but also, there's diversity of political systems around the world. So this doesn't apply everywhere, but I think also making sure that we're actively engaged citizens on these issues and pushing a variety of, if where possible, government leaders to make sure that sustainability is on the agenda and accountability of business on the topics is on the agenda.
And fantastic. So whatever you are, that's really your vote. You vote every day going to buy and purchase, but also make sure that this, and the example of Malaysia is really something that we can even from our side in Africa could be an important part, because we play an important role in the supply chain, and it's really important to move the wheel forward. And actually could be from this side of the world, helping the global north to become even more sustainable. So that would be interesting. So we will put, all the links in the description. I think it's a book worth reading, because and it would be a lot of food for thoughts for you and for your choices. And I'm really grateful, Chris, for having you at the podcast and to share your wisdom and your research with us. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Samuel, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.